Hello and welcome to the Lincoln Journey. Today in episode 22 of the Conspirators, we will talk about Execution Day. The arguments in the trial of the 8 accused conspirators ended on June 28, 1865. The 9 members of the military commission deliberated for the next 2 days with the able assistance of Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt and Assistant Judge Advocates John Bingham and Henry Burnett, the case's prosecutors and legal advisors. Assistance from defense counsel was not required. All but one of the defendants, Edmund Spangler, were convicted of conspiracy and murder, and 4 of the 7 so convicted were sentenced to hang. Were some more guilty of conspiracy and murder than others? Remember, the military commissioners agreed, apparently during the 2 days that they considered their verdict, that unlike a civil court where it took a unanimous vote of a 12-member jury to reach a guilty verdict, in this court, 5 of 9 was all you needed to convict, and any defendant with 6 or more votes would hang. Arbitrary? Seems so. Unfair? I think so. Appealable to a higher court? Absolutely not. Leaving Spangler out of it, Harold, Powell, Atzerodt, and Arnold were all found guilty of everything they were charged with. Why did only the first 3 hang? The main difference between them and Arnold seems to be that Arnold wasn't in Washington the night of April 14th. There was a good chance that he only knew about the kidnapping conspiracy. But that still made him guilty of murder, at least in the eyes of 5 commissioners. This is where the arbitrariness of the sentencing bothers me. I can see all of the commissioners finding him guilty of conspiracy, but deciding he should get prison instead of hanging. But I can't see 4 commissioners saying he was not guilty of conspiracy. Arnold actually confessed to the kidnapping conspiracy. Maybe in their secret session, the commissioners just decided to stack the vote to make it turn out that way. But then, what would be the point of making the rule? Mary Surratt and Samuel Mudd had similar charges. Once again, the one in town the night of the killing sentenced to die, the one out of town sentenced to life in prison. Also, it's very possible that 4 of the commissioners truly didn't feel there was enough evidence to convict Mudd. In Mary's case, we know there were at least 6 votes for conviction, so there were 0 to 3 votes to acquit. And immediately there were 5 votes for clemency, so 3 to 5 of those voting to convict wanted clemency. Wasn't there an easier way of reaching that conclusion than making up an incarcerate at 5 votes, hang at 6 rule? President Johnson had to approve the findings and sentences. Judge Advocate General Holt was charged with conveying the court's decisions to Johnson, but the president was ill July 1st through the 4th. He approved the verdicts on July 5th. The execution was set for July 7th. The 4 prisoners condemned to hang learned their fate on July 6th. The government had fallen behind Secretary of War Edwin Stanton's aggressive schedule of trying and executing the conspirators before Abraham Lincoln was buried. But Stanton was hopefully gratified at the alacrity with which the commission's sentence was carried out. The defendants sentenced to hang were given 1 day's notice to prepare their souls for eternity. Their advocates had that same day to plead for delays or clemency. It was a fraught day. On Thursday, July 6th, Penitentiary Commandant General John Hartranft, accompanied by his superior officer, General Winfield Scott Hancock, visited each prisoner to be executed and read out their sentences to them. Davy Harold seemed to have been taken by surprise and was undone. He protested that he hadn't personally killed anyone. George Atzerodt feigned disinterest but was betrayed by his trembling. Lewis Powell maintained the stoic posture he had affected throughout the trial. Mary Surratt collapsed in tears and begged for mercy. Hartranft Ever the sensitive prison warden asked the condemned whom they wished to see. Then he did his best to locate and summon persons requested, mostly family and clergy members. The government didn't bother to inform Mary Surratt's attorneys, who learned of the verdict and sentence from the newsboys hawking papers on Washington street corners. The Surratt lawyers immediately set about seeking a writ of habeas corpus, given that their client had never been examined by the civil justice system. A judge granted the writ, and the court served it on General Hancock. Under orders from the president, Hancock refused to comply. Mary's daughter Anna went to the White House with Father Jacob Walter and tearfully begged to see President Johnson. She was fobbed off on to Judge Advocate General Holt, who gave her no hope. Anna then spent the night with Mary in her cell and returned to the White House the following morning. Her pleading became more and more unhinged, but she only got as far as the president's secretary. Two of Harold's sisters also pleaded with Judge Holt, finding a similar lack of success and departing in bitter tears. Inmate visitors made their way to the old penitentiary that day and through the night to the sound of hammers building a sturdy scaffold on the grounds of the prison. The gallows, completed on Friday morning, was 20 feet long, 15 feet wide, 10 feet high to the floor, and 20 feet high to the beam that held the ropes. The other prisoners heard the noisy construction, but could only speculate on its purpose. They didn't learn of the executions until after they had been completed, or of their own sentences until almost 2 weeks later. Sam Arnold recalled that with the trial having ended so recently, it didn't even occur to him that the erection of a gallows could account for the pounding. Most people were unaware that the efforts to spare Mary Surratt from hanging had been in vain, and there was a widespread expectation that a commutation would arrive from the White House prior to the executions. Hangman Captain Christian Rath tied the customary 7 knots in the nooses until he came to Surratt's. Convinced she would be granted a reprieve, he quit after 5 knots. Photographer Alexander Gardner, who had photographed Booth's body and the live prisoners on the ironclads, was permitted to photograph the execution. He set up in 2 windows of a building about 100 feet from the scaffold. Earlier, he had photographed General Hartranft and his staff, 4 of whom sat on the chairs that would be used later that day on the gibbet by the condemned. At 1 p.m., the prisoners were led across the yard and up the 13 steps of the scaffold, accompanied by about 15 guards, officials, and clergy. The sun was oppressively hot. Guards shielded the prisoners' heads with umbrellas. About 100 civilians, each requiring a pass signed by General Hancock, stood on the grounds, inside windows, atop buildings. A file of troops was on hand to prevent disruptions. General Hartranft read the order of execution while 2 priests administered last rites to Mary Surratt. Guards bound the prisoner's arms and legs with strips of white cloth. George Atzerodt spoke some faltering words of farewell to the gentlemen who are before me now. He, Surratt, and Harold had been unsteady in some degree, while Powell remained erect without support. Captain Rath, admiring his courage, whispered in his ear while arranging the noose, "I want you to die quick." Powell responded, "You know best, Captain." As Rath moved to Surratt, he still couldn't believe a woman would be executed. He turned to General Hancock and said, "Her too?" Hancock told him, "She cannot be saved." Mary complained that her wrist restraints were too tight. Someone assured her, "Well, it won't hurt long." After the adjustment of the nooses, white cloth hoods were placed upon the prisoners' heads. When all was ready, Captain Rath clapped his hands 3 times. On the 3rd clap, soldiers knocked away the supports under the hinged drops. Death appeared to be instantaneous for Mary Surratt, and nearly so for David Harold and George Atzerodt. However, in spite of Captain Rath's wishes, Lewis Powell struggled against his bonds for a full 5 minutes. After 20 minutes, the bodies were cut down. They were buried a few feet away from the scaffold in the penitentiary yard. When the penitentiary was demolished in 1867, leaving only the building where the trial took place standing, where it yet stands today, The ammunition boxes containing the remains were reburied under the floor of a warehouse at the Washington Arsenal. In 1869, while handing out pardons to the remaining convicted conspirators during his last days in office, President Andrew Johnson released the bodies, including that of John Wilkes Booth, to their families. However, Lewis Powell's skull somehow ended up in the Smithsonian Institute, where it was found and identified in 1993. It was respectfully interred in a Florida cemetery in 1994. I've already related the fates of the others tried in the Lincoln assassination conspiracy: Samuel Arnold, Samuel Mudd, Michael O'Loughlin, and Edmund Spangler. For several days after the executions, the prisoners took their daily exercise in the yard within sight of the gallows, not knowing whether they would themselves mount its 13 steps. Finally, on July 17th, they were separately informed of their sentences. The military commission sentenced Arnold, Mudd, and O'Loughlin to life imprisonment and Spangler to 6 years, all to be served in the county penitentiary in Albany, New York, which began taking federal prisoners during the Civil War. However, as the sentences passed to the White House for the president's approval, Andy Johnson amended them, changing the destination from a model reformatory to a sun-blasted rock. The prisoners presently boarded a gunboat that landed them a week later at Fort Jefferson, Dry Tortugas, Florida. The old penitentiary housed other prisoners during the incarceration of the accused conspirators. Willie Jett, who led the cavalry troop to Booth and Harold at Richard Garrett's farm, arrived at the same time as Dr. Mudd. He was a witness in protective custody. This protection ended on May 27th when Jett and Captain Joao Celestino were released to the custody of General Christopher Auger, commander of the forces protecting the capital. George Atzerott's cousin, Hartman Richter, in whose house Port Tobacco was taken up, accompanied Atzerott first to the Monitor Montauk and then to the old penitentiary. Restrained like the others in irons and the torturous hood, Richter was freed of these on May 13th and sent to the old Capitol prison. Jefferson Davis's private secretary, Burton Harrison, went to the old penitentiary when President Davis was imprisoned at Fortress Monroe. After the executions, Richard McCullough and Thomas Harris arrived for relatively brief stays. They were operatives of the Confederate Secret Service involved in developing chemical weapons. On the same day that the conspirators and Spangler departed for Florida, McCullough, Harris, and Harrison were escorted to other prisons. "This disposes of all the prisoners," wrote General Hartranft to General Hancock, and thus ended Hartranft's duty as commandant at the old penitentiary. He headed home to Pennsylvania, where he was elected governor in 1872. This did not, however, dispose of all the issues connected to the trial. Public criticism of the decision to try the defendants by military commission rather than by a civil process, and the liberties taken therefrom, continued to find its way into the columns of newspapers opposing the administration. The most persistent charge leveled against the government was that it hanged an innocent woman. Rumors spread that Harold and Powell both proclaimed Mary Surratt's innocence, and that even Louis Weichmann asserted that he had perjured himself in implicating her. When asked to respond, Weichmann denied this. Harold and Powell were unavailable for comment. In time, the outcry surrounding Mrs. Surratt became a pro- and anti-Catholic issue as much as a North-South issue. We could, if we wanted to, dig into the long history of the claim that the assassination had the support of, if not its genesis in, the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church. Why else would Mary's son, John Surratt Jr., the Surratt that got away, be found in the service of Pope Pius IX as a member of the Papal Zouaves? I do not propose to waste your time with crazy conspiracy theories. The true conspiracy theory is crazy enough. But, as promised, we will take up the Surratt who got away. I hope the Papal Zouave thing would get your attention. We will take him up very soon.